Let's come to Nature 8, and let's do a reprise of going back to the beginnings of what it is that we're inquiring about. Let's go back to Thoreau, and there is a section in Walden on reading, and just a few sentences from Thoreau to give us a beginning, a droplet of how it is that we're hearing the language which I am speaking, rather than speaking of cadencing, because I speak in a poetic and not a rhetoric. Thoreau writes, "The works of the great poets have never yet been read by mankind, for only great poets can read them. They have only been read as the multitude read the stars, at most astrologically, not astronomically. Most men have learned to read to serve a paltry convenience, as they have learned to cipher in order to keep accounts and not be cheated in trade. But of reading as a noble intellectual exercise, they know little or nothing. Yet this intellectual reading, in a high sense, not that which lulls us as a luxury and suffocates the nobler features to sleep the while, but what we stand on tiptoe to read and devote our most alert and wakeful hours to." And so we're in an endeavor to learn, but to learn in such a way that we are not co-opted by an overstuffed mind. And the difficulty is that we have been inculcated constantly to lead off with our mind, to check with our mind, and to conclude with our mind. But what we're considering is that the symbolic mind is only 1/8 of an entire complex process, a field of inquiry, and the forms that emerge from not just a field, but at least 4 different registries of that field and 4 different registries of form from those 4 fields. A field has no form formally, but it has a process. And the ancient way to talk about that was that it was dynamic. The Greek word dynamis gives us the word dynamic. It is in motion. And its motion is an energy wave. It has a frequency. It has peaks and troughs, like all energy waves. And you can index that energy wave either by the peaks or by the troughs, or you can index it by the amplitude squeezed into some kind of a time measurement. And in fact, a very interesting thing happens, that if you take the peaks and the troughs as a pair and exchange their places, the dynamic energy whirlpools into form, and you get atomic structure from which one can build molecular structures, from which one can build cells, and eventually ourselves. It is the exchange of centers in a paired amplitude that give us the stability of form, and because it emerges energetically into matter, the matter is not static, but it is vibrant. It occurs as an iterative of the amplitude of the way in which the dynamic has been energized. And so the higher one goes in forms, one also goes deeper and more expansive into fields and processes. And out of this comes an increased energeia. And that Greek term, energeia, was always the energy that form can now, in its, not just its stability, in its objective vibrancy, it can bestow a higher order of the field of the dynamic. Our first dynamic is nature, and out of nature come the vibrant forms of what exists. The existentials, literally, of particles, of atoms, of molecules, of elements, of beings, stars, moons, etc. Those existential forms have always, in their vibrancy, in their vitality, they always have an aspect where if one could really understand what they are what occurs in their action of being vital. And in our time, we have adopted an ancient Sanskrit for that, and that is karma. But it also is a ritual form, a ritual comportment, so that existentials have an active form that is determined, as we will see, by the way in which the sequences of the actions are delimited by this kind of exchange of peaks and troughs brought into the energy of matter. Those energy forms now have a reciprocation, a reciprocality to their very structure. And so when we come to understand ritual, because we're beginning with a phase of nature, which is a process field, and our next phase will be a formal phase of ritual comportment, of actions that are limited and delimited so that they make objectivities. Literally, what we do objectively happens as a form, as a structure, and that structure has a resonance. It has a formance, just like the process of nature has a formal resonance as well. The process of nature has a resonance as the experience of culture, and the resonance of the existential forms of action actually occur as symbolic thoughts in the mind, and that symbolic thoughts are objective and have a direct correlation. They have a referentiality as a higher integral, not just of things, but of how things are in their action. So that the correlation is on the basis of a practicality, that symbols and rituals will have a practicality to themselves that is integrable, be able to be brought together, and not just together, but continuously more and more together, so that the focus of it becomes more and more energized, more intense, more vibrant, so that it is possible to step the mind up, to step symbolic thought up into an incredible intensity of integration. And that integration, as it climbs in the ordinal condensation, the concentration, the ancient name for this in Sanskrit was always dhyana. dhyana is where the concentration of the mind comes more and more to a single focus. In Sanskrit it was called ekagrata, one-pointedness of mind. And it does not stop there because the integral is not based on one. The one is the form that emerges, but the integral has for its source zero. And so the one-pointedness of the mind, if one's intensity increases, one can go beyond one-pointedness. And how does that occur? It occurs because the one-pointedness vanishes. It vanishes in upon itself. The Sanskrit word for that was bindu. The experience of the mind which has vanished from its one-pointedness, the experience is called moksha. But something occurs because the zeroness is at the same time a fullness. A oneness reoccurs instantly, spontaneously, out of the zero, because it always does, exactly in that way, and one reoccurs. But now one reoccurs with an extra dimension to the dimensions of space and time. One reoccurs with a fifth dimension, a quintessential dimension of conscious vision able to transform the other four. And so the other four no longer just occur in a way of flow and rest, of stability that vibrantly energizes. It's no longer just a field and a form, but one has the field of nature, the forms of ritual, the field of mythic experience, and the forms of the symbolic mind. But the third process, as we will see, visionary consciousness, weaves back into the other two processes and produces in this wovenness a new fifth dimension, a quintessential quality of transform. So that now nature gives itself over to transformational consciousness. And experience, which for all of its lifetime, for all of its lifetimes, for all of its millions of years or billions of years of experience, where its existence has been in between its experience of living and the natural mysteriousness, now all of a sudden the mind discovers that it is in between the process of experience and the process of consciousness weaving together, and the mind acquires a new quality. But it takes a while to appreciate this. And so we do what ancient wisdom traditions always did. We carry ourselves back through from the sources, from the beginnings, and let ourselves re-mature, recapitulate the phases of how we came to be who we are. And in doing so, we comb through progressively a realization that our symbolic minds were misused. Instead of being integrators and integrals that are able to a mind that is clear and open, so that one has, with the four phases of the cycle of nature, the four seasons of our first year all together, a mind which is not only open so that its pointedness can become honed through concentration even into the vanishing, and allow for the reemergence out of that, not a vanished emptiness, but out of a vanished openness. Now the mind becomes transparent. Sri Aurobindo once had a beautiful phrase for it in English. He called it the mind of light. That what shines through the mind here, in the Vajrayana it's called clear light. That one now sees not things and only things, but one can through things, through their transparencies, and one can see psychically. One sees the extra dimension of conscious vibration that is there, and one learns to see not only into things, but through them. One of Jane Goodall's books that we are using here at the middle of our excursion through nature is called Through a Window. My 30 years of experience with the chimpanzees of Gombe. And we move from Thoreau to Jane Goodall by a very special process that is very much like walking. The alternation in walking, the bipedal motion, also is very much like the energy wave of the frequency of a dynamic. And with the peaks and the troughs, we are able to make our way and gain a sense of not only motility, but of balance as well, and of adapting ourselves to a calibration then of the amplitude of the dynamic as the source of the vibrant structure of the forms that will emerge from it. And by this acquaintance, we begin to have a special sensitivity. Our experience of nature now begins to become more and more mysterious. And so in a way, the mythic horizon of experience can be deepened into mysteriousness. And it is the bringing of this increased mysteriousness into the mind that matures the mind, matures its integral, so that it is able to have more and more concentration, more and more dhyana, more and more capacity to meditate. And its meditation now becomes focused in such a way that it understands that in its experience, three aspects of the flow of mythic experience begin to become salient. One of the aspects is that images occur from the existentials of the world, and they occur first of all in our body, and then they vibrate in our experience, and it's that vibratory experience that the mind now brings the images together in an imagination, the imagination. And so the mind acquires the imagination from images that register in the body. They register in objective existentials, but they vibrate, and the tone of their vibrating in experience becomes the source of feeling. So that images and feeling are now linked together so that the imagination in the mind has a feeling toned quality to it, and that feeling tone quality is a very powerful integral, more and more, that becomes the feeling toned integral of one's sense of individuality. And so the mind gains its individuality in just this way. But the individuality is prefigured, as it were, prefigured in the way in which we live by the actions we do, and configured from that in the experience of our images and our feelings and of our language. And so the mythic horizon, which is the better way to talk of it, myth is the use of spoken language to carry the images and feelings that flow and are healthiest when they flow with the way in which nature works, which nature has its dynamic. And so culture and nature are like a parfait. They flow together, and when they're in sync, as it were, culture is said now to participate mysteriously in nature. We not only belong in nature, but we are natural. Our culture is a natural culture. And in between that, the rituals of objective existence become more and more tuned. The body becomes healthy because our way of living, our traditions, our communities, our sense of images, our sense of feelings become toned. Our use of language becomes increasingly supple because it flows with nature. And when we talk about things that are real, things that are objective, and the mind now gets a referentiality to objective actions that indeed have this veracity. And so the mind and body now become tunable together. So you have a pair of forms and a pair of processes, and when they're in tune together, you now have something which our phases allow us for the first time to appreciate. You have a frame of integral reference. You literally have a window. You have a picture of how this individuality in this mind, with other individualities in their minds, sharing a cultural tradition, sharing a source of images, an image base for a common imagination held in common, and a language that we are able to speak to each other. And also the feeling tones become increasingly vibrating together, and this becomes emphasized. The dance is not just in the steps of the sequence of the action, but of dancing together. And in the dancing together, there is increasingly a sense of carrying the vibration of the dynamic of nature into the dynamic of culture. And one of the nicest ways to speak of this is all over North America. The North American Indians called this stepping. That the basic motion of stepping tunes you to the resonance of the dynamic of how nature really works, and now mysterious nature and culture really works this way as well. And out of this comes the rhythm of the way in which language becomes increasingly articulate. Its rhythm becomes a cadence of expressiveness. And if you have ever heard primordial storytellers, the myths from the mouth of ancient tribal storytellers, they will always have that stepping cadence to their voice. I remember 35 years ago, in Calgary, Alberta, of teaching a course on world mythology. And I wanted to include a lot of native North American Indian materials, myths from North American Indians. And so I brought in the oldest storyteller from the Algonquin language family, the Blackfeet, the Blood, the Piegan, the Sarcees. I brought in an old Sarcee Indian storyteller named Hanson's Bearpaw. He was in his late 80s. He was blind. He did not speak English and would not have agreed to come to the university to deliver, the myths. So I had the myths delivered in the Indian Friendship Center in downtown Calgary. We had about 300 people show up. More than 150 of them were tribal members who came to hear the myths, the stories. And Hansen's Bearpaw got into the stepping cadence of his Algonquin mythology, and his great nephew translated instantly so that those who could not follow the Algonquin could hear what he said. And of course, right away, one got the experience of psychically of him using the old storyteller's cane to establish his rhythm, to establish his cadence, and to use a language that flowed in such a way that it configured by the contours of experience, flowing around focuses and attractions and curving to avoid dead ends, and this choreography of the experience of that mythic language began to have a different quality in one's mind. Instead of the mind coming together in some kind of egg crate grid that can be applied like doctrines and codes and laws, the mind got used to an ambidextrous fluidity of form that allowed for it to have a new quality of suppleness. And one noticed, after about an hour of Hansen's Bearpaw delivering that kind of language, not the language of equipment, but the language of contouring in the depths of the dynamic of nature, the bodily movements that one had a different tone to them. The best phrase from experience of this, it felt when you moved, when you began to walk, that you were scuffing clouds, that you were walking in an atmosphere of fertile mystery, like not the rain clouds that are gloomy, but the rain clouds that bring the fertility of life, only it was in your movement and in your step. And the quality of it was that you were rolling on the feeling tones of an imagery like this. And of course, we are always pairing. We're always putting a tuning fork out. And paired with Thoreau, we were using the Chinese I Ching. Not to study the I Ching as a symbolic record, but to go back to the I Ching as a natural expression like Thoreau. Thoreau as a natural person, the I Ching as a natural expression of how the cadences of the dynamic of nature in fact always have this kind of symmetry, and that the symmetry has a pair of properties, a pair of qualities, a pair of actualities, that at the centers of the symmetry there is an ability to exchange centers. And at the extremes, not the ends, but at the higher and higher registries, one gets a complementarity of infinities. And at the lower beginning sources, one gets the complementarities of zeronesses. And one learns that when one lives in nature, the amplitudes are of unendingness, and that they, in fact, link together in an unbroken dynamic that now has a special nature to it. It has within it attractors that are paired that generate a magnetism, a magnetic. One of the most primordial ways of expressing this in primordial peoples around the world is to take the two hands and hold them up like this with your fingers, and to take about a 6-foot length, about 2 yards, of string. It can be plant fibers, it can be human hairs, it can be anything as long as the two ends are joined and make a loop, not a knot, but they're joined together in such a way. They used to use very fine threads, vegetable or fibers, so that what one has now is a loop. And that this loop is an unending loop. It's an infinity. And if one holds this between the two hands, and you begin by making a cross between the two in the center, one now has the beginning of string figures. The original one called Cat's Cradle. And out of Cat's Cradle, one can make string figures, and they're made all over the primordial world. Almost every culture has it. And our pair to Jane Goodall is Mary Leakey, disclosing the past, and she says that she learned to make about 60 or 70 of these string figures over the years, and she learned the significance of them from her husband, Louis Leakey. And Louis Leakey learned them from his African childhood. He grew up with the Kikuyu tribe in Kenya, and he learned that every tribe in Africa has their own variants of string figures. And he learned from his professor at Cambridge, A.C. Haddon, who was one of the first to write about the fact that string figures seem to be everywhere in the world, and that they're a primordial way of very sophisticated making different kinds of forms out of a simple loop. Hands, as long as you keep interchanging at the centers and keep letting the expansion of it go into indefinite infinities, one can have almost any number. Haddon once characterized about 2,000 string figures from all over the world. The first person to ever write a monograph on string figures anthropologically was Franz Boas, a young German mathematician who had a taste in the 1880s for adventure, and he went on an expedition to the Eskimos in the Arctic. And when he got to Baffin Island, he forgot all about math. He got into anthropology and became one of the world's greatest anthropologists. His 1888 monograph, The Central Eskimo, is the first time that there was a chapter on string figures. And one finds not only this Caroline Furness Jane's great book, 1905, with an introduction by A.C. Haddon. It was about this time that Louis Leakey was born and grew up in Africa and found that his relationship to nature, unbeknownst to him, was actually Kikuyu and not European. And he never realized this until he was sent away finally to university, to Cambridge, to St. John's College, Cambridge, England, and discovered that he dreamed in Kikuyu, not in English, and that his sense of language, his sense of feeling tones, his sense of imagery were African, and so he called his biography White African. And one of his close friends at Cambridge, a man to become very famous later on, Gregory Bateson, whose great book in the late 60s, Steps to an Ecology of Mind. Bateson was also the husband of the great anthropologist Margaret Mead, the father of Catherine Bateson, who's still alive. Louis Leakey learned that it isn't just the string figures, but It is all of the play of the Africans that is of an extraordinary richness and primordiality. Haddon says in his introduction to string figures and how to make them that he first, as an anthropologist, paid attention to the complexity of primordial, so-called primitive peoples when he was in the Torres Strait, down at the southern tip of South America. And he found that their string figures are much more complex than European string figures. Louis Leakey said there's a special game played all over Africa that is too complex for Europeans to master because their minds get in the way. Just like the very complex string figures, because primordial peoples will not only use their fingers, their teeth, their toes, and they will put an extra quality on where you not only make forms, but you make forms that sometimes disappear because the loop comes back out, and these are like trick figures. And there are variations in between the forms and the forms that pull clear. There are little catch figures that when you pull in a special way, they end up by entrapping a finger or a palm, and that one is snared. So you have forms, and you have just the open loop, and you have the little snares in between. And that these figures and the game that all Africans play, 12 holes in the ground, 6 of each of 2 lines of holes, and 6 little pebbles or berries that go into each of those 6, 6, 6. So the object is for one of the 2 players to get the most of these pebbles, the most of these berries. And you do it by however the beginning is. That player takes all of the berries from one of the holes and can go left or right. Either way, it's ambidextrous. And you put a berry into each of the following holes. And if you do this in such a way that you can continue to play, you can continue to keep this motion by taking all the berries now out of the last hole and redistributing them, but in the counter way to however you started. And you keep doing this until you come to a point where you have not placed any of the berries in the other player's arrangement of holes. Then you lose your turn, and that person begins then and does the same thing until that happens. The only way that you can keep playing is that you must have a crossover to the other person's territory. And the winner is whoever has the most pebbles or berries at the end. It's a way of expressing the mysteriousness of nature and culture, of the infinities and of the zeroness, not being endangerments, but of being expansions where our experience can play. Let's take a break. We'll come back in about 10 minutes. Let's come back to characterizing what a complex learning that we have. And its complexity is not mental. It is operative, both as a pragmatos, as a pragmatic, and as a prismatic as well. So it involves not only the ability to sequence and bring them into an integral, but to transform the entirety of the integral, phase by phase, if you wish, the whole of it, if you wish, any detail to whatever specificity you need. And so it is a new kind of a learning. I call it the yoga of civilization, and it is new. It has never been done before like this. Our basic presentation uses books because the book form of language that is written has been used for 2,000 years and is so indelible, it's like the grain of the historical developments that we have, our minds and our world have all this grain, and we can hopefully wean ourselves away, but not to wean ourselves away so that we do not use books, but that we use them as a part of the array which increasingly is before us. But instead of using a book as a text, which dead ends in the way in which the mind indoctrinates itself by a text, we pair books together so that the pair of them has a ratio capability, a proportion capability. They're tunable, they are ratioable, and they give us the amplitude and the trough of a dynamic if we continue to do so. And what would be the periodicity? The periodicity I use for this, because it is cognate then with all the other periodicities that I use them for 1 moon, a lunar cycle, 1 month. And then we move to a second pair, another pair, for the next lunar cycle, for the next month. And if we do this 1, 2, 3 times, 3 lunar cycles give us a season. But in order to let that season have its phase quality, and for the next phase to emerge in its own right, we have a week of interval in between the phases. And at that point, instead of using a pair, which would interfere with the phasing, with the dynamic energy wave that we're creating with our paired books, our paired people, in the interval, I use a single classic spiritual work. The first one with nature, I use the Tao Te Ching, and I use my own translation of the Tao Te Ching with an auxiliary volume called Multiple Introductions, because something like the Tao Te Ching is not just a book, it's a harmonic of resonances, and so one has to have the multiplicity of approaches to it in order to let it have its space to do its cooking. When I was 19 at the University of Wisconsin, I was a poor student, and in order to live, I cooked at an Italian restaurant owned by the Chicago Giancani family in Madison, and I learned for 4 years how to cook from an old Italian woman named Maria. And she always said, you have to give the kitchen plenty of space and give what you're cooking plenty of space to move around. You let the pasta swim and don't stuff it. And for the sauces, you simmer them slowly with the meats and everything. And that cooking in this way then turns out to be very tasty and also easily digested. Our learning is paced so that not only do we have lunar cycles that make seasons, we have 4 such seasons that will make an annual year, and the annual year will have a solar cycle quality related to the lunar, 12 lunars, but will also include 4 intervals, so that the 4 intervals in a solar cycle will be like an extra month. But not a month tacked on in addition, but a month calibrated. Will be a solar version of a lunar cycle. But in order to nourish that year long, we have another kind of a book I call them book journeys. And there are 4 of them that constitute, each one by itself will be a separate track by which to do the pairs of the lunar cycle books. And the year-long readings, one is Homer's The Odyssey. One of them is Ovid's The Metamorphoses. One of them is Melville's Moby Dick. I use the 150th anniversary edition that just came out with the Maori resonance mask, the chiral magnetic field, human face. And the 4th is by a woman, Lady Murasaki, who lived about 1,000 years ago in Japan and is one of the most sophisticated writers of all time. The Tale of Genji is written at a time where the over-masculinization of power in that shogunate Japan had to be tempered in order to make life possible for women and children, and also for men outside of the power struggle, the samurai ethos. And so the Tale of Genji is about raising Prince Genji by very intelligent, sophisticated palace women who teach him how to be human without truncating his ability to be a powerful prince, and eventually, who knows, perhaps even the shogun. And yet, one can live with him. One can interface with him. Each one of these year-long readings I've portioned out in our course navigational outline, so that if you are choosing the track, say, of Moby Dick, we're at Nature 8, so the 8th would be the section called Knights and Squires in Moby Dick. If you're reading the Odyssey, the 8th would be Book 4, starting with lines 420 and moving just a couple of pages. And the same for all of the selections. And I've portioned out these year-long readings so that they will be distributed in such a way that they will cover the entire annual shape of a year of the education. I used to call this the snowshoe effect. I had a friend in Canada who was from India. He was a Bengali, and they're very affable. And he was aerial reconnaissance, a petroleum expert. And he could read the landscape and the maps and tell where the exploration needs to go. And he had never been in snow. And so he decided one day that he would walk out from the camp. They were up on the Mackenzie River. And he walked out what was like about a city block's worth into the deep snow, and didn't realize until he got out that just that far that he was completely physically exhausted from walking in 3 to 4 foot drifts of snow. And when he turned to go back, he realized, being a very competent engineer, he figured out he was not going to be able to make it back. He wouldn't have the energy. He was sweating, he was getting exhausted. And of course, on the upper Mackenzie River, it can get very, very, very cold. When the wind blows, you can have a 50 or 60 degree below zero wind chill factor. Luckily, one of the Canadian cooks had been watching him and walked out on snowshoes on top of the snow and gave him a pair of snowshoes. And he was able easily to walk back. And I remember my Bengali friend telling me this, and I've always had a respect. The primordial way to make your way is to learn how to be where you are in its natural terms, and then you can go with freedom. We not only have the year-long book going with these make a basic energy wave. This added to it makes what we would call then a reference wave. And when you have a wave and a reference wave, now the dynamic is not only a process, but it is a vector, which can be calibrated. And you can tell that you're going in that vector. Now you have an ability to have trajectories, but also, because we do not just stop here with a reference wave, but we have something else. We have the ongoingness of the learning, and the notes from the previous phase now that were not available in that phase, at the end of that phase, I make them available, and so you can read the science notes from the previous phase along with the nature phase as it occurs. And by pairing the written notes with your basic wave, you get a new kind of a wave. This is called, in physics, a pilot wave. And it has everything to do with memory extending, the ability not only to have another vector, you have a reference vector, now you have a pilot vector, and when you have two vectors, now you have the capacity to have a tensor relationality. Now you can do relativity and quantum mechanics. And one of the interesting books that came out a while back was from John Bell, J.S. Bell, one of the leading interpreters of modern quantum theory and computers. This was published, Speakable and Unspeakable in Quantum Mechanics, Cambridge University Press. He says of a pilot wave developed from de Broglie's mathematics in quantum theory by a genius named Everett, and at the time, 1957, when he first came out with it in a monograph, everyone said, this is science fiction. This cannot possibly be. Each observer has representatives in many branches of a linear Schrödinger equation, so that it is just an illusion that the physical world makes a particular choice among the macroscopic possibilities contained in the expansion. They are all realized. And no reduction of the wave function occurs. All possibilities are equally real if you have a pilot wave active. And it goes on from there, and Bell's little monograph on this was exceedingly powerful. We have our notes previous, so that if you look at Science 8, Science 8's notes written as a pilot wave, the title of that presentation was Ancient and Future Women. Because we were using at the time a pair of women, Barbara McClintock, whose half-century of studying Indian corn, maize, and understanding that the genetic structure, corn has just about 11 or so chromosomes instead of our 23, she found that the genes in the chromosomes of maize surprisingly jump around and give a kind of evolutionary variant mutation capacity, so that a genome is not a static thing but has an element of play in it. It took about 30 years for people to catch up with Barbara McClintock and realize they're called now jumping genes. It is not a plan that is engraved and that's it. God is not a fundamentalist. He's a realist. And she knows how to be transparent and have exchanges in the center and to have complementarities in the infinities and in the zeros as well. if we have the pilot wave and the reference wave, and we have 4 different tracks for the reference wave, so that in an active population of people doing this, you will have 4 different tracks for the reference wave, but it will be highly individualized because what is used in the basic wave will always be up to the individuality of the person doing the learning. And so you get a kaleidoscopic variation, which is literally infinite. The more persons who do this together, the better it works in terms of disclosing not only its complexity, but in that complexity, the basic infinity sign, double attractor coherence, like the cat's cradle string game, that the variations are of indefinite relationalities that increasingly give not only an integral, but a differential that is a harmonic. You can have any number of resonant sets that will constitute a harmonic. I use the octave because that's the music we're most used to, from the ancient Egyptian all the way through classical music, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. But the second do is not just do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, but that second do is the beginning of the raising of that octave 1 note higher, so that the next octave will run in an ordinal way, and like on a piano, you'll have a little bit over 11 octaves that you can play. But one can have, like the Chinese, a pentatonic scale of music, 5 instead of 8. Or in India, there are many raga possibilities of different scales, and early in the 20th century, Arnold Schoenberg showed that you can have a 12-tone serial scale and compose very well, and that it was recognized by the late 20th century. There are an infinite number of musical scales. We will never run out of new music, ever. And it doesn't matter how many trillions of star systems have music, there will always be new musics to be found. But interestingly, NASA put out about 20 years ago a little whistle that if you blew it, it was the sound of our planet in orbit around our sun. And that every planet in a star system has a different tone. Its bow shock imploding into the solar wind gives a particular note, so that one could have, like the pipes of Pan, the sound of the 8 basic planets in our star system, and you could sound them together. That would be the chord, the actual Pythagorean mystical chord of the music of the spheres in its pitch pipe completeness. But in order to get to that quality of sophistication, not being awed by it, but having it available for our play, for our further learning, we have a number of other enrichments that go into this, not just the reference wave and the pilot wave, but we have an enrichment of the way in which the basic wave is generated, and that at each time, each phase has its musical composition. These are 2 versions of the same composition. Alan Hovhaness, it's called In God Created Great Whales. He took the songs of humpback whales and made a symphonic piece. And so we use that in the nature. And at the end of nature, the interval will have its own musical augmentation. We're using Stravinsky's La Sacra du Printemps, the Rites of Spring, so that each phase with the interval together will have a pair of musical, not just tones, but musical compositions that will allow for you to give whatever complexity you need, so that at the end of a year, you will have had 8 selections of music arranged in an ordinal, ascendant and descending order. And we have, of course, not just 1 year, but 2 years. So we have a double annual cycle. So that what you get is not only form and its referent that are practical, because they integrate, and they integrate to any degree of identification that you would like to have. But we get the differential as well, which has a complete different ecology, as Gregory Bateson in Steps to an Ecology of Mind put it. Nature will have cycles, but consciousness will have an ecology. And once our consciousness has an ecology, we are able now to weave that ecological sense of harmonic back into the complete cycle of nature and recognize there was a hidden ecology in nature as well. And that there, therefore, is a very magical kind of transform. There must be a cycle in the ecology of consciousness as well. And so nature and consciousness have an interchanging, interpenetrating quality. On the most minute level, they will have an entanglement, so that once there is a harmonic between 2 electrons or more in some kind of a vibrant form, no matter where they go in the universe ever after that, they will always be tunable together. And on the higher register, there will always be in reality a complementarity which is infinite, which does not preclude it being in a harmonic or being resonant or being consonant. Rather, it is up to us to be able to be sophisticated enough, refined enough to be able to tell this, not just to know it, because the mind as an integral form has its limit naturally and needs to be open to transform, to go into the differential unlimited. So that while the working binary in an integral universe will always be 0 and 1, in a differential cosmos, the binary is 0 and infinity. And it takes getting used to this. Now, our next pair of books, we're going to use 2 very interesting groups of people. First is the double helix, James D. Watson. Watson and Crick discovered the double helix, because a natural cycle, when put into time, does not deliver a circle, but delivers a spiral. As it circles, it moves forward in time, and so it has a spiraling quality to it, so that the cone of time-space in a dynamic actually has this spiral quality to it. It can be very tight. And in fact, if it is very tight so that the next circle of the spiral is just one element more expansive than the previous one, you will get something of what an old LP record used to be, a 33 1/3 record. You can record something linear, like a piece of music, on a tightly wound spiral, and have a perfect playback from it. And this way, the mysteriousness of nature lends itself to be woven with the conscious magic of visionary process, and one now gets something like the phonograph record. We're taking not only the double helix, but we're taking with it a book that has just come out called Macroevolution, Diversity, Disparity, Contingency. And this book is by both a man and a woman. And they wrote it together because The third figure, who was a lifelong friend to those two, had just died. His name was Stephen Jay Gould, who was one of the most magisterial figures. He not only wrote on evolution, he wrote on everything conceivable. He had a monthly column in many national magazines. He wrote on baseball, he wrote on politics, he wrote on evolution, and his great magnum opus that came out just at the time he died at age 59 was about a 1,500-page book on evolutionary theory published by Harvard. The two editors are his friends, Elizabeth Verba and Niles Eldridge. Niles Eldridge is the curator of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and Elizabeth Verba is at Yale University and publishes the Paleontology Society in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and a number of other places. We're going to use their macroevolution, a series of little vignette essays brought together and paired with the double helix of Watson, of course, about Watson and Crick, to complete Thoreau and the I Ching, Mary Leakey and Jane Goodall, and then Watson and Verba and Eldridge, and conclude the first phase with the Tao Te Ching. When we moved then to ritual, the next phase, we're going to pick up a thread from the I Ching and from the Tao Te Ching, and one of the first books that we'll use in the pair, the first pair, will be Confucius Analects, the Lun Yu, which is about the ritual comportment that the Tao Te Ching is about the non-ritual comportment. But the I Ching was completely changed by Confucius because he wrote 10 commentaries on the I Ching, and they became the 10 wings, and they're folded into the I Ching so that we not only have the I Ching of 3000 BC of Fuxi and Nugua, and the I Ching of King Wen and the Duke of Zhou, the beginning of the Zhou dynasty, about the time of the Trojan War. But we have the Confucian I Ching that has been used as one of the classic state exam texts in China for 2,200 years. The state exams were used up until 1911, and still today one finds creeping back into China the Confucian ethos that one must be very careful about what you do and keep it consonant with tradition on one hand and with insight possibilities on the other. Otherwise, you lose balance. You lose symmetry. You lose the ability to have creativity, and that the creativity comes from a very special exchange of centers. The center of the mind in its imagination changes places with the center of visionary consciousness, which is not a thing, but a process, remembering. So that when remembering goes into the mind, it becomes the memory. And the imagination, when it goes into consciousness, becomes creative imagination. Now you have the ability to have art out of a center that not only remembers, but basically is enthused because it can creatively imagine. And later, the other conscious process history will be when the creative imagining is still operative, but the conscious remembering comes back into play more. And so it's like electromagnetism. You always have electro and magnetic together. But in the electromagnetic spectrum, it's the electrical that takes the attention with the magnetic as a smaller adjunct to it. But those equations of James Clerk Maxwell solve the other way as well. There's a magnetoelectric spectrum where the magnetic takes the forefront and the electric supports it as a smaller role. Those two together weave. And in their weaving, they make a cosmos that is not only visionary and magical, but one that is historical and memorable. Have you never heard? God is the Lord of history. In our learning, in order to have a contemporary quality along with the nourishment of the music, we have every phase 4 films, and the 4 films for nature that were selected so that they deliver a quality of enrichment in a measured way, a paced way, a stepping way. We begin with Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast. And we move to Fred Schapisi's The Iceman, about finding an oil company finding a frozen man 40,000 years old, and he is brought back to life. And they discover that he was on a visionary journey that had to be finished, and 40,000 years made no difference whatsoever. He has to finish his journey. The third film is Quatermass in the Pit, about a science fiction story set in London where they're making a subway tunnel in London and they run across something buried. And they think it's a bomb at first, but it's very big, it's very unusual. And it turns out to be a ship, a spaceship from Mars that had come to Earth 5 million years before. And that in the spaceship they found apes that had enlarged brains, that they'd been surgically altered on Mars and brought back to Earth to seed a new kind, not a new kind of humanity, but a new kind of organic vehicle which the Martians then could psychically inhabit and save themselves by being able to live in our world. The fourth is Forbidden Planet, based on Shakespeare's The Tempest, set in the great star system of Altair, and the crew that goes there finds the only survivor of the expedition is a Dr. Morbius, who has learned to read the language of the Krell, who disappeared from the planet in one single night 2 million years before, because they had perfected the ability to have psychic projection of matter anywhere on the planet instantaneously, all of them. And when they did, they forgot, as Morbius comes to understand, that there is an elemental primitive quality, the mindless primitive, out of which they had evolved and comes back into play. And in one night, all of the Krell send all of their personal hidden demons to each other, and the entire planet is depopulated. Says the spaceship commander, played by Leslie Nielsen, the great comic actor of later times, but he's the young Canadian actor who plays the courageous pilot of the spaceship that's come to relieve them. Walter Pidgeon plays Dr. Morbius. Morbius says, "But the last Krell died 2 million years ago. How can there be one of these psychic, demonic phantoms?" And Nielsen says, "You don't understand. Your own psyche has tuned in. The machine has tuned itself to you. It is your personal demon that killed everyone else and is killing my crew. You're the one, and you are helpless. You cannot do anything about it." This is a way of nourishing through music and through film and through a quality of activities we call projects. And each phase has its own set of worked out projects. Taking the cue from Thoreau, the projects for the nature are to take 4 walks. One walk is from where you live in any direction, left or right, but that the second walk then should be the opposite direction to keep some symmetry. If you walk from where you live around to the left and come back home, the next week take a walk to the right, around and come back to where you are. And then the third walk is to go the same direction as before, but further out, longer, and come back to where you are. And then if you do that, second walk, the fourth time, further out, and you come back. This is the ancient technique of Paleolithic hunting. No matter where you are, if you keep the butterfly effect going in a symmetry, you will not only explore where you are, but you will give it natural coordinates so that you will know where you are, not intellectually, but that your body will be at home in the landscape because it will be a vibratory remembering in its very body. That's why you find in primordial peoples always this kind of magnetic, chiraling, tattooing, not just on the face of the tattooing, but the whole bodily experience of landscape is that it is like being tattooed psychically to it. Once upon a time, North America, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, the entire landscape was sacred mounds, effigy mounds, animal mounds, not just one or two mounds, tens of thousands, the entire landscape, because it's very ancient. The blood types show that American Indians have been here in two great waves, one of them 12,000 years ago, the other about 25,000 years ago. And they didn't come just by a land bridge, that was 12,000 years ago. The originals, oddly enough, came across the Pacific Ocean from Oceania because the string figures that the American Indian tribes all have are related to the Asian string figures, especially Southeast Asia, and very much like the Australian Aborigine string figures and the Oceania island string figures. They all have a cognate quality. And as Louis Leakey points out, and Mary Leakey learned, and she points out, and Jane Goodall, who went even deeper, learned. It isn't just Paleolithic man. It isn't just other species of hominids that go back 2, 3, 4, now 7 million years, but the great apes, the chimpanzees, the gorillas, the orangutans, that go back 70 million years. They have a particular vibratory waveform. Primates, like the great apes, came in 70 million years ago with two cognate qualities of evolution. One, for the first time, you have flowering plants. And two, you have trees. Before that, you had giant ferns, but no trees. Ferns became trees. Weeds now even have flowers. And primates that are 98% of what we are occurred altogether 70 million years ago. What we're trying to appreciate next is not only can we go back 70 million years, but through macroevolution we can go back 500 million years. And through the double helix, we can go back 3,600,000,000 years to the beginnings of life on this planet, to the beginnings of living forms. And when we go back to the original bacteria on this planet over 3.5 billion years before, we discover that there have been a couple of major evolutionary developments that originally were not there. And because they have occurred, instead of there just being single cell, now there are multi-cell organisms. And we'll start next week by taking a look at these two together. Thank you for your quietness.